We're at Genesis chapter 13 and chapter number 14 is where we're going to try to cover this evening. And we have had this journey together. We've looked at creation. We have looked at the different stories leading up to this point. And now we've come to the introduction of Abram. We see where that Abram has journeyed and he has come to this land, and he has along with him on the journey someone that we're going to talk about tonight, and his name is Lot, and he has his wife whose name is Sarai, and we know later on their names are referenced as Abraham and Sarah, and we're going to come to some interesting stories about them later on. But here we come to chapter number 13, and this is an introduction to Abram's return to Bethel. Now, we just got through talking about a really wild situation where Abram is deceitful. He tells that his wife is actually his sister, and leads the Pharaoh there to believe that. And then we see that God sends some plagues and sees that he actually leaves the land with a lot of wealth. And he's taken with him more than what he brought. I mean, he's in a good position right now. He's got a lot of wealth, a lot of resources. And then we come here to, like I said, chapter number 13. And these first 13 verses are actually quite interesting. So let's look here at these first few. And this is starting in verse number 4. We'll read through verse number 4, chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. It says, "And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord." Now, as we look at this, we're going to see Lot come into this play, and it's going to be a lot of talking about Abram and Lot and the interaction here that we see. But as chapter 13 opens, we see there's a great description, like I mentioned earlier, of wealth. But then there turns to the actual location of where he'd returned, obviously to Ai and Bethel, where he'd built the altar to God. But his return to this location builds anticipation, I believe, that Abram will act similarly to his humble, obedient behavior when he first entered the land. And this is found in chapter number 12. Instead of according to the self-driven choices he made in Egypt. A lot of that was made because he was self-driven. It wasn't anything other than what he was worried about himself and what may happen. Now, the description that we see of Lot is actually quite interesting. I don't know if you've ever picked up on words before, but words mean a lot, especially in the context of the passage here. So, when we look at this, we see in verse number 1, it says, "And Abram went up out of Egypt and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him." And so it's almost like Lot's an afterthought here, but also at the same time, Lot's tagging along. And as Lot is tagging along, he has gained a lot of resources. He's sort of like the individual that's tagging along with this family and this journey, and he's just building up wealth. He's building up these resources. And the repeated description of Lot, as with Abram, strengthens this association. Lot, rather than being part of Abram's household, is not presented in a manner that more closely resembles a fortunate just individual that's just hanging on. Look what it says here in verse number 5 again. "And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents." Remember that wording that I'm telling you about. "And Lot with him," verse number 1. And then verse number 5, it says, "And Lot also." So Lot, like I mentioned, he's just tagging along in the journey, and he's just coming along with them. And then we see here in verse number 6, "And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And then verse number 7 says, And there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. Now, this hanging around, this that he gained, this that he was able to possess for himself, created a strife. Now, where does this strife come from? Well, I believe it comes from a situation of being crowded. There just wasn't enough resources. There wasn't enough available for all of them. But also, they were there with other groups, the Canaanites, the Perizzite individuals. And so the land could not sustain all that was there, because when we're talking about this landmass and we're talking about what they needed, that's a lot of cattle. Now, there's no telling how much they had with them from the journey when they came from Egypt, but they had a lot. So Abram had his, and Lot had his as well. And so here we see that this strife begins. And so the Canaanites in the land complicated the care of Abram and Lot's continuing growing people and livestock. So it wasn't just that they had what they had, but it continued to grow. It was a continual thing. It wasn't they were losing, they were actually gaining. And so something had to happen. And so here we see that there's this strife that was created. Now, what happens in strife? Arguing, I'm sure, happened. There was bickering. Okay, my cattle get this food over here. Well, wait a minute. I thought mine were getting that food. So here we see all these disagreements that were taking place, these arguments. But the most important thing is what we see here in verse number 8. And this, we're going to pause on this just for a moment, because this is a good lesson for us all to follow after. And Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we be brethren. See, Abram cared not for Lot, that he was able to follow along with him. I believe that Abram treated Lot just like he would a son. I believe he welcomed him in. I believe that he entreated him. He was good to him. And here we see that Abram steps up to the plate. And what does he do? Even though there's this strife, there's this possible animosity, he says, hey, let there be no strife, because we are brethren. And what does he say here in verse number 9? Look at this. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart, tagged along, that Lot benefited from the blessings that Abram had received. He knew all this. He saw it all. But to actually say, okay, if you want the left, I'll take the right. Or vice versa. He said, if you want the right, I'll take the left. You get the choice. You get to do whatever you want to do, and I'll take whatever is there. So the land that Lot eyed, here, and this is talked about in verse number 10. Look at this. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan. Then it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. So like Egypt and like Eden, the plain of Jordan was associated with temptation. Moses, the writer, inserted a reference to the yet future destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, if you recognize that here in this passage of Scripture, for the city's wickedness. And Moses also plainly stated that the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against God. Sodom was beautiful and fruitful, but ripe with temptation. So Lot's choice was actually quite selfish in itself and unwise. He was focused on something more than what he was supposed to be. He was focused on prosperity. He was focused on indulgence and taking the opportunity to break away from Abram so that he could take his own life, he could take life into his own hands. See, he had followed Abram for so long, and he thought to himself, okay, I've got everything that I need. I'm just going to move on my way. I'm going to go in a different direction. And he wanted to become a possessor of many things, and he wanted to become a possessor of much wealth. And as I think about this, and I thought about Abram was quite the peacemaker here in this passage. You know, there's a good book I read while I was in seminary. It was about being a peacemaker and trying to just be at peace in situations that you're dealing with. And in church, oftentimes, if there's a turmoil, if there's a problem, you always want to try to find a way to find peace. Because you don't want strife in the church, that's for sure, because we see enough of that. Oftentimes, in churches and like this situation where they split ways, you see where possibly two people can't work together because of a methodology of how they want things to be done. And I've seen this happen in church, and where, unfortunately, at times, it may cause a church split. I've seen that happen before. Or it's just that someone says, okay, I don't agree with these certain things, this way of how that it's being done, and they'll decide to move on. There's actually an account of this, and I can't recall. It's about John Mark. It was a disagreement with Paul and Barnabas, right? About John Mark. Remember, they had their disagreement, and they had to spread and go a different way. It wasn't that they were unethical in the way that they were handling things. It was just a disagreement on how that things should be done. And so in times like that, it's good to be a peacemaker instead of strife. We know that Paul and Barnabas obviously later reconciled over that. But interesting here as you see this with Abram, because Abram was willing just to let Lot choose. And this was huge on Abram's part to have this take place. Now, Abram's actions, I believe, demonstrated that he understood God was the possessor of all, and therefore he could hold his possessions very loosely. See, Abram knew that God would work out the details of his promises. So Abram pursued peace above perceived prosperity. And Abram lived by faith, and Lot lived by sight. See, God had promised Abram that He would bless him. I mean, remember those promises, the ones we talked about before, the promises He had blessed him? And I believe Abraham recognized this. He recognized that, hey, if God's promised this to me and I'm following after, and He's promised me these land and to be known and have descendants, this is something that's actually going to happen. So here we see Abram and Lot. They go in different directions. And this comes to verse number 14 and 18 about Abram's sacrifice to God. Look at this. And it says, And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward. So Lot has left. He has went his way. And now the Lord tells him to lift up thine eyes and look in all these different directions. And it says in verse number 15, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. Now, Abram has reacted this way toward Lot, and Lot has went his way. And then as soon as Lot is out the door, not physically out the door, but he's left, wouldn't it have been something to have heard this from God? Look up. Look all around you. I'm giving it to you. And see, this is just a reminder. This is a reminder to Abram and to thy seed forever. I mean, this isn't something temporarily. It says, to thy seed forever will I give these things. And then look at verse number 16. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. God is once again reaffirming the promise that He had given to Abram. And then He says in verse number 17, arise, walk through the land, in the length of it, and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto you. So God directed Abram to walk the length and breadth of the land. Now there's something interesting about this in a cultural perspective. See, the walking of the land was not only to give Abram an awareness of the land promised to him, but this was also part of Abram's legal acquisition of the land. Cultures during this time period to Abram utilized similar devices to symbolize the receipt of land or kingdoms. So new kings or rulers were known to circle the walls of their capital cities or tour the boundaries of their kingdom as they began their reign. So this was something that was a cultural thing as well. So the length and breadth of what was there, this was God telling him, hey, this is yours. And see, God would give Abram the land because he was the only one that could give it. He owned the land because He's the creator of all lands. He's the creator of all things. Just like we talked about in the beginning with the creation of the world. He created all things. He put the mountains where they are. He put the stars where they are. He was the only one that could give Abram this land. And God would make that point clear in future steps that we'll be talking about. So Abram moved his tent to Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. This is in verse number 18. Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. And so with Abram building an altar to sacrifice to the Lord, Abram understood who God is and acted thoroughly. His string of good decisions in light of who God is continued, as we will see in future verses here. So interesting set of circumstances here. Chapter 12, not so good with how things were dealt there in Egypt. But here we see that Lot is with him. There's strife. He reacts in a way of being a peacemaker. And Lot goes his own direction, and then God gives that affirmation. He says, listen, Abram, this all that you see is yours. Your descendants will have all of this. And man, I'm telling you what, that probably was just a breath Abram could breathe in and breathe out, knowing, man, it's good to know that God's promises are true, that He's been promised to, that He will receive, His descendants will receive. So that's where we see leading up to chapter number 14. Anything about chapter 13 real quick? All right, chapter 14. We haven't heard the last of Lot, because Lot goes off and Lot loses it all. He finds trouble. So this second part is about Abram rescues Lot. So Lot loses it all. Look with me in verse 1, and we'll read down to verse number 11. And it came to pass in the days of Amphrael, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, that's a hard word to say there, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Beri, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shimber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Shittim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year, Chimdorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth, Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emmons in Shaveh Kirathim, and the Horites in the Mount Shira unto El-Pazran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to Empashtet, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, also the Amorites, and dwelt in Hazapar Tamor. And there went out of the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zerubbabel, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Shittim, with Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, king of nations, and with Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elishan. 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Shittim was full of slime pits. And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountains. And they took all the gods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals, and went their way. Now, if you read those 11 verses really fast, and you can get them perfect, you're good. All right. But here we see that God's involvement in the Genesis account. We've seen God's involvement before, working behind the scenes of situations here. And this intentional omission of referring to God's activity sets the stage for showing Abram's growing understanding of God's possession of all. See, Abram, yes, has been told these promises, but he is still growing in his understanding as well. So we see in these first 11 verses a lot of history. And I'm going to have to read some of this to you because it's really hard to follow, yes, with all these names. But there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of history here. So there's 4 kings from areas in modern Elam. This is actually Iraq. And also Shinar, which is, Elam is Iran, and Shinar is Iraq. And they put the people of the Jordanian plain and southern Dead Sea area, including Sodom and Gomorrah, under a tribute. Okay? So after 13 years, those that were under a tribute, they rebelled. Okay? They rebelled, and this triggered what? A war. Now, if there's any type of rebellion, they're not just going to be like, oh, it's okay, you rebelled. No, there was a war that took place. So this triggered a war as the 4 kings of the east, led by King Chedorlaomer, of Elam, invaded and defeated the people who lived east of the Dead Sea, as well as those as far as El Paran. The armies then turned back to attack the Amalekites in Kadesh Barnea before continuing northeast to address the rebellious kings who lived just south of the Dead Sea. Now, this is possibly where Sodom and Gomorrah were located. The roundabout path the kings of the east took was probably to ensure that no one would attack them from the rear as they headed to address the rebellious kings. The kings of the east were victorious over the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding areas. They plundered the cities and took, here's the situation with Lot, because we know this is where Lot is. They took Lot, all of his good, with them to Dan, which is north of what is now the Sea of Galilee, about 160 miles from Sodom. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah barely managed to escape, and that's what we find in 14 verses 8, and actually also verse number 12. So let's read this here in verse number 12. And they took Lot, Abram's son, who dwelled in Sodom, and his goods, and they departed. So Lot has had all this good for a certain period of time, and he has went his way, and nobody's there anymore. There's no Abram. And he has ventured out, remember, on his own in a selfless, or a very self-centered, I should say, type of manner. And now it's taken from him. I mean, he's stripped literally of everything. He doesn't have anything anymore. And then we come here, let's read verses 13 through 17. And there came one that has escaped. Someone had escaped. We don't know who it is, but someone had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and there these that were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued there unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants by night, and smote them and pursued them unto Hobah, which is the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people, and the king of Sodom, and went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shavah, which is the king's dale. So after hearing about what had happened, Abram gets this news. Lot's in trouble. And you know what's interesting is that Abram could have said, well, he's went on his way. He's made his bed. He went his direction. I went mine. But here's something else that's very interesting about Abram and how that he has grown. It says that he quickly took up arms. He mustered 318 of his best loyal associates and went and pursued the enemy. Now, this would really make a cool movie, I think, here. I mean, first of all, you've got someone that doesn't deserve this to come after him, but Abram's heart, he has this peacemaker about him. He takes these individuals, his loyal associates, and they travel here to find the enemy as far as Dan. Now, the size of this army was 318. Now, we don't know the size of the other army that they were going to be facing up against. Probably wouldn't have stood a chance in today's culture, but we don't take that into consideration of what the world thinks, because we know that it doesn't matter how many we have. If it's in God's will and if it's in God's purpose, it's going to happen. It's going to be a good thing. So Abram attacked the invading armies at night from two different fronts. Okay? His men successfully defeated the kings of the east, pursuing them north beyond Damascus. And Abram freed Lot and recovered his goods as well as the goods belonging to the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. So what Abram does, he says, all right, guys, I got this plan. This is what we're going to do. Go in and attack. And they cleaned them, they beat them, and then they brought all the resources back. Now here's something else that's interesting to notice. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't lift a finger to help Lot. See, it tells us back here earlier in the passage that they fled. Okay, so while this is going on, they're hiding, they have fled, but Abram embarked on a dangerous 125-mile rescue to rescue Lot. Now, oftentimes we read this and we hear about Abraham and we don't really focus in on this passage that much. But boy, that tells me a lot about Abram. He could have said, like I was told you earlier, Lot took what he took. I have what I have. He's made his bed. But no, he goes to rescue Lot. And one would think that this would cause Lot to realize that he doesn't have much loyalty from the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. Hey, if I'm there and I've got to know them for a short period of time and they've abandoned and they've fled, that tells me I don't have a lot of loyalty, or maybe they just don't care about me so that much. And this would have told him how much Abram cared for him. Now, anybody would think, I'm going with the people who care about me. But this doesn't happen. Lot remains there in Sodom and Gomorrah. But here we see that after this, we see a blessing that Abram receives. So as Abram returned from defeating the kings to the east, he was met by the king of Sodom and the mysterious king of Salem, Melchizedek. Look what it says here at verse number 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Now, there were several Salems in that day, and it's possible, even likely, that Melchizedek was king of Jerusalem. Perhaps the name Jerusalem was shortened to emphasize the idea of peace, because it could have been transliterated, Salem. But Melchizedek greeted Abram with a meal and is described as the priest of the God Most High. And this is the first actual reference to priests in the Bible. But here's a question, and he is so mysterious. Who is Melchizedek? Heard about his name before. Who is Melchizedek? Anybody with a thought? It's not an easy one to describe. Melchizedek's name means King of Righteousness. And he was the king, he was a king of Salem, Jerusalem, and a priest of the Most High God. Now, Melchizedek's sudden appearance and disappearance in the book of Genesis is actually quite mysterious. It is. If you want to know how mysterious it is, just go look up Melchizedek, and you'll find books that have been written, commentaries that have been written with great detail, lots of content, sometimes with just a thought or maybe an assumption on what this possibly could be. But here we see that Melchizedek and Abram first meet after Abram's defeat here. And Melchizedek here presents him with the bread and the wine. And this demonstrated a friendship. And he bestowed a blessing on Abram in the name of Most High God, which is in the Hebrew is El Elyon. That is the Most High God reference that's given. And praise God for giving Abram a victory in battle. Look what it says here in verse 19. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth." So Abram presented Melchizedek here in verse number 20 and says, "And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand." And he gave him tithes of all. So Abram presented Melchizedek a tithe to tenth of all the items he had gathered. By this act, Abram indicated that he recognized Melchizedek as a priest who ranked higher spiritually than he. Now, once again, we're very limited with what we know here within the context of this passage, but as we know, there are other references to Melchizedek. So what does all this mean? Who is Melchizedek? So we've got to go look at some other references in Scripture to find out what this means. In Psalm 110, there is a messianic psalm written by David. And in this, Melchizedek is presented as a type of Christ. And this theme is repeated in the book of Hebrews. If you look at Hebrews, there's a great description talking about that comparison there, about Melchizedek and his unique priesthood as a type. And the writer shows that Christ's new priesthood is superior to the old Levitical order and the priesthood of Aaron. Some also propose that Melchizedek could have possibly been a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, or a Christophany, which is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. This is a possible theory. Hebrews 6:20, listen to what the writer says. He says, "Jesus made an high priest for even after the order of Melchizedek. Now, this term order that's mentioned here in this passage here in Hebrews would ordinarily indicate a succession of priests that's holding the office. None are ever mentioned in the long interval from Melchizedek to Christ, and thus the order is eternally vested in Him alone. Like I said, this is really deep. It's a very mysterious type of thing that we see here, but this is what we know. Hebrews 7:3 also says that Melchizedek was without father or mother. That's interesting, isn't it? No genealogy, without beginning of days or life, resembling the Son of God, and also remains a priest forever. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is this with that reference. Is the author of Hebrews meaning this actually or figuratively? That's another question you have to bring into the equation here when you look at Melchizedek. If it's literal, then it is indeed difficult to see how it could not be properly applied to anyone but the Lord Jesus as being pre-incarnate here. If the description is figuratively, then the details of having no genealogy, no beginning, ceaseless ministry are simply statements. In this case, the silence in the Genesis account concerning these details is purposeful and better serves to link Melchizedek with Christ. So I know that's probably way up here with that description, but it's a mysterious thing. It's a here and then gone, that reference there. And so I personally believe this is a Christophany. I believe this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ here with Melchizedek. Now, once again, there's things in the Scriptures that we probably will not know and fully be able to grasp our minds around until one day we are with God. I mean, there will be the things unveiled for us to fully understand because we are limited in our thinking. But here we get back to this just for a moment where Melchizedek has done this, and then it comes here to verse 21. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take thee from a thread, even to a shoe lasset, and that I will not take anything that is mine, let thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. Save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion. So this is interesting, how Abram has responded in the midst of all that has taken here. And so Abram refused to take the goods from the king of Sodom, and he wanted to avoid a dubious connection with the city. This is interesting too, a connection there. Because he trusted God more than the provisions that were made from men. And while denying his own rights, Abram did not force his allies to make the same decision. If you notice that there at the end of the passage, he allowed them to take their portion of the spoils, and that's what we see here in verse number 24. He didn't answer on their behalf. He said, let them make their decision on what they're willing to take. So a lot's been spoken here. Lot, his journey with Abram, the strife, them going their different ways. Abram comes to Lot's rescue. And then we see the big one there with Melchizedek. And then Abram responds in this way and lets his individuals decide for their own if they will take the spoils that has been presented to them. So that's a lot for 13 and 14. Anybody got a thought on any of that? Maybe you got something to add to the Melchizedek thing.
Obviously, Sodom and Gomorrah were not the sinful cities that they were when God destroyed them at this time, right?
I think there was temptation there. I don't know quite what was going on. It may have gotten worse, but it still was considered to be a place of temptation. That's why Abram would not receive what he did from the king when it was offered from the king of Sodom.
Well, in that scripture there, it says it was a wicked place.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think,
Let him save himself then.
yeah. I personally feel like this is a testament to Abram's character here, because obviously I think he cared enough for Lot. He had to, because of sending his men to go and fight to rescue him, but also to avoid the strife. Because if he would have lived there or continued to let Lot be there, who knows what that could have led to. So Abram was thinking bigger than what that situation was, about what that could lead to. And so as he said, okay, you go your way, I'll go mine, and you take whatever you want. He gave him the choice. I mean, he gave him the choice of what to take. And Lot just was not thinking in a correct manner. And that's why he chose the direction he went. Very self-driven, I think you could say. But don't you think for a moment, I mean, yeah, Lot sees that Sodom and Gomorrah, the kings there, had abandoned, they didn't come to help. But aren't you thankful, don't you know he's got to be thankful that Abram came, because he was in trouble. There would have been no way he could have gotten out of that if it wouldn't have been for Abram coming and rescuing him. But then he said, you make your decision. And he did, and he went back. And we know where that leads to eventually. We'll come to that. But this Melchizedek, that's always been a very interesting thing to me. Mysterious. Melchizedek blesses Abram, and then just a very interesting figure. Always has been. I believe it's a pre-incarnate of Jesus. We know there's different appearances, like in the three Hebrew children, the pre-incarnate, the Christophany, a pre-incarnate of Jesus, yeah.
What really speaks to me out of this study is that Abram, he does what he feels right, is right within his heart, and he lets the cards fall where they may, and he trusts that God's got it regardless of what everybody else is going to do.
Mm-hmm.
He just followed his heart and just trusts that it's going to work out.
Yeah.
I was going to kind of speak to that point also. It's like sometimes we feel like we get a word from God and we feel like we got to make all these choices to line it up. And he knew the promises were coming to him regardless of what everybody else did. So he let the cards fall
Absolutely.
where they may and let other people make those decisions, knowing and trusting that God had it worked out for him regardless.
Yes. I mean, just Abram holding these things loosely, knowing that God's already told him, and that he knows he can count on that. And once again, after he's told Lot this, and Lot goes his way, I think that's God's way of lifting him up and just once again just giving him that assurance, that comfort to know, hey, listen, look around you. I've given this to you. Your descendants will have all this. I mean, just that affirmation of knowing this is a promise that I've given to you, and this is here. This is for you. Yeah. Here's a question, and I'll close with this. So he sends those individuals to fight and to rescue Lot. Do you think Abram knew without a shadow of a doubt that they would win? I believe, yes. But I was just asking you. I always like to think on those things. Like when he went and he sent them, he had to have known that he was going up against a mountain. I mean, he was sending out ants into a mountain of fight. I mean, bigger battles and more people to fight. But he sent these individuals to fight. And yeah, I believe that when he sent them, he knew that God would give them the victory, because God wouldn't have given those promises unless he was going to get the victor.
And the scripture says that strife is reckoned through him as righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
God is made righteous because of his death.
Yeah. One last question, then I'm done, okay? I like to ask these, just get you thinking. Why do you think that Abram gave Melchizedek the 10th, the offering?
Because he was a high priest.
Okay, yeah. What else? What else do you think? I was reading back over a note, and I made a note here. Do you think Abram gave that 10th as a offering to God, recognizing the high priest order for his providential work and how all this took place? Just thinking. I like to read back over things and kind of think about things a little further. I think that's the reason why that he did that, to give thanks to God for the providential aspect. Remember, he's working behind the scenes through all of this, so I think that's a big part of it.
Do you think Abram recognized that Melchizedek was different? Was God in the flesh, so to speak? Or do you think he would just thought that he was a great person?
It's a good question. Yeah. Once again, yeah. I think like I said, it's a mysterious situation here. We don't have anything that says that he didn't or he did. But I do think that he recognized that position because, like I said earlier, Abram, in the name of Elyon, that Most High God that was referred to him, he would have recognized Melchizedek in that order. So whether he recognized him as a Christophany, I don't know, but I believe he recognized him as
Somebody special?
yes, I do. What do you think, Max? You
The fact that he had no beginning of days,
yeah,
when he first come into Canaan,
yeah,
it would have been known that Melchizedek had always been there.
yeah,
Nobody could remember him not being there.
yeah,
King of Salem and king of righteousness.
yeah,
So he was a part of Canaan land.
yeah,
So I think respect because the whole country knew of nothing but him always been there. He had no beginning of days.
yeah. And that makes it mysterious too, that aspect of it, yeah.
And they all knew their genealogy of whatever so well, they all could go back. And he had none,
Yeah,
Many had lived and died, but he had always been there.
yeah, he'd always been there, yeah. Yeah, they could say about Melchizedek, they've seen him come and seen him go. And I mean, there's no beginning and no end. So that's what we take as a look at the Christophany. So. It did, didn't it? I've just always been intrigued by Melchizedek. Like I said, I've read several things, and some way, if you try to explain it, it's probably not as adequate as it should be. But once again, when you're trying to describe something as mysterious, it's sort of like, and I'll close with this, when you talk about the Holy Trinity, I believe 100% in the Holy Trinity. But for us to try to describe it in our own way, we are so limited that we're trying to think as God thinks and as God works. And we can't because we're not God. And so when you think about that, we take it by faith, believe that it is true and how that it works. Now, there's little things that you can describe. People have used illustrations about this, and this, and it's one. But still, it so falls short of the adequate explanation of what it really is. And we're just so limited in our thinking. So, but I think here it's just it's a mysterious thing, yes, but it's interesting to note that it's part of the story and part of the greater picture of the great high priest. And we know this came down as Jesus is our great high priest. And so that's something to remember. All right, thank y'all for being here. And hopefully you've been learning something. I've been able to go back through this and read again, and I like to dig up and research things I haven't researched in a little while. So it's good. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully it hasn't been a bore. Hopefully it's been fun. All right, hey, thank you. Stand up. We'll pray tonight. If you won't mind, stand to your feet. And we'll pray and we'll dismiss. Ernie, would you pray for us, please?
We thank you, Heavenly Father, again for this day. Thank you for this in the Lord Jesus, our Savior. Thank you, Lord, for the study we had tonight. And that you bless our pastor, our Lord, to continue this Saturday, give him, to give us his insight. Thank you, my Lord, for this day again. Faithfully put across the way we just read tonight today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.